Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. A warm welcome to all our attendees today. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. The topic for today's discussion is how AI is making contract management easier and more effective. My name is Ajay Agarwal. I'm the founder and chairman at Sirion Labs, the enterprise leader in contract management, and I will be your host for today. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. The webinar slides and recording will be emailed and to all the attendees, and we request you to enter all questions in the chat panel on the webinar panel that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. What are we going to cover today? We have one of the world's leading experts in contract management to describe the current state of AI in contract management. He will also talk a little about how AI addresses the traditional barriers across contract management's life cycle. And most importantly, how AI-powered contract management can extend beyond the conventional boundaries of legal and contracts and make the overall business more stronger and more successful. Our featured speaker today is Andrew Bartels. And Andrew Bartels is a vice president and principal analyst at Forrester and their lead analyst in contract management. He is a leading expert on tech market trends, on cloud and smart computing technologies, and tech's impact on business operations. He is a thought leader in buy-side technologies and one of the world's leading analysts for contract lifecycle management. Welcome, Andrew, and I will now turn it over to you to walk everyone through your insights.
Thank you very much, Ajay, and good morning to those of you in the U.S. Good afternoon to any of you in Europe. Thank you for joining us today. Look forward to talking with you folks about contract management and the role of artificial intelligence in making contract management easier but also more effective. And we want to keep those two concepts in mind. So let's start with contracts. Contracts today are absolutely critical. Every business runs on contracts, and those contracts define its relationship with its key suppliers, in many cases with its employees, and in certain cases with its customers. Not all customer relationships are bound by contract, especially in B2C, but almost every B2B relationship is defined by a contract. And so because contracts are so critical, they need to be created by business in a quick, effective, but controlled way, and they need to be accessible to business, but they also still have to retain legal control over what is in the contracts. So contracts have this, to start with, stakeholders on both the business side, because this is what business uses to define the relationship with their customers or suppliers or partners or employees, but also from the legal side. And this is a key aspect of thinking about contracts is you've got to start with just at least these two stakeholders who focus on contracts. Next slide. These two stakeholders are important because if you think about a typical contract, you quickly come to the realization that it contains two basic sets of information that relate to two different kinds of roles. First, contracts define who does what at what price when everything works as planned. It's the agreement you strike with your customers, your suppliers, your employees to say, hey, here's what you're supposed to do. And we agree we're going to do that. And on a day-to-day basis, that's 95% of contract value. It's what you use then to define those transactions between partners using the contract language. But the irony is only about 10% or less of contract language actually deals with this issue of who does what. The other key role is contracts play is they define who is responsible or liable when things don't work as planned. Now, of course, most of the time, 95% or so, everything works as planned. But 5% of the time, things don't. And that's when you need a contract to address this question: liability, responsibility, who does what. And that's why 90% or more of contract language lies in this area. This is what legal worries about. They want to get into the contract all of the conditionalities. And so if you think about a contract over its total life, about half of the value comes in that day-to-day activity, but a half comes in that worst-case scenario. And that worst-case scenario has turned out to be kind of important right now when, in fact, we have this worst case of a pandemic that is totally disrupting business life. And so that time when things don't work right turns out to be this is one of those times. Next slide, please. Now, many people think of a contract management solution as a repository, a place where our contracts can be stored and accessed by anybody who needs to get that contract information for managing relationship, for defining who does what. And certainly contract repository is a central and key part of any contract, but it's only one stage in the life of a contract. The first stage is typically drafting negotiation, establishing what is going to be the relationship that we have and how does that get reflected and put into a contract that defines both who does what when things go right and who is responsible when things go wrong. In many cases, though, of course, the contract is not one that we ourselves initiate. It may be one that we get handed to by a partner, and we have no choice to live with that. So you have to import that. Of course, once a contract is created by ourselves, and once it's imported, it goes in the repository where it's stored and then made accessible, as I said, to anyone authorized to review that contract. Could be a salesperson, could be a vendor relationship management person, could be legal. It's not full visibility. Everybody is controlled, but it's there and accessible in an online version, as opposed to having to call down to legal and say, hey, can you pull that contract and send it up to me? The availability of the contract then is critical for contract compliance administration, being able to make sure that that contract is in fact being executed as intended, both in a day-to-day transaction sense, but also as part of a broader relationship. Now, contracts themselves can also be improved. So part of what you want to do is look at the contract and say, what can we do better next time, which is contract optimization. And of course, not all contracts typically have a life cycle. They have an end at a certain point. So you have to then renew that contract, which then sends you back through that process in terms of how that's going to play through. So what we call contract lifecycle management is software that handles all these stages of a contract, from initiation to repository to ongoing execution to optimization, ultimately renewal. Next slide, please. Now, contract lifecycle management does certain specific tasks, supports certain specific activities. So I said, first of all, it's supporting all the stages of a contract: drafting, negotiating, execution, to replacement. It's kinds of contracts: buy-side contracts, sell-side contracts, employment contracts, intellectual property contracts, any contract that you have. A good CLM system will have Microsoft Word or comparable word processing document interface, because that provides easy adoption by people who touch it, such as lawyers. Lawyers typically live in Word. That's what they're used to working in, and so you want to be able to do that. Employees use that way. But they also often provide a browser interface, and that browser interface may be used by employees when they want to initiate a contract, to assemble a contract. And of course, once it's any contract may go in and out of Word multiple times. It may go be generated as a result of the CLM, turns into Word, then gets circulated, changes get tracked, brought back into Word, or out of Word back into the system. So this ongoing flow of the content into Word, out of Word, back into Word, into the system, keeping that going and supporting both the interface and the actual record of what's agreed. A contract repository, though, in isolation, doesn't really help with a lot of issues. So you want to have that contract repository linked to transaction systems that you use for purchasing, for order management, for invoicing, for customer service, any systems that need to be able to see what is it that we have agreed with our counterparty, what have we agreed with our customer that we're going to sell them, what service level we're going to provide, what price are we going to quote to them. Every time that we engage with them, we want to be able to have that data available in the transaction systems that support those activities. We also understand what's in our contract portfolio. We want to understand how many contracts do we have with a particular customer or with a particular category. How many contracts we have which have certain language of them. Right now, for example, how many contracts could be subject to force majeure, which is this new, not this old language that says, if certain events happen, then we mutually agree that the contract is canceled. How many contracts do we have that have intellectual property protection, different kinds? So a wide variety of reports and analytics that comes when to be accessed to understand what is in our contract portfolio, what entitlements, what risks, what obligations do we have that we want to be able to track, manage, and get value from. As I indicated at an earlier stage, not all of our contracts come from our own system. Many come from counterparties. So you got to be able to quickly be able to import a third-party contract, or perhaps a legacy contract. Import that, bring it into the repository, and tag it with the right metadata tags so you can use it for future analysis. And contracting itself is a step in what is often a multi-step process on the buy side or the sell side or other partner relationships. For example, a buy-side contract may be preceded by a sourcing event in which the two parties define the deliverable, the scope, the product, in a sourcing event, and then turn that into a contract, and then manage that contract in different ways. On the sell side, a salesperson may be using one application for tracking leads and another application to determine what's the price configuration or quote we're going to make, and then turn that into a contract. So there's linkages also to the processes of buying or selling, sourcing or negotiating that CLM pits against, and other ones related to legal operations, matter management, for example, in legal operations linked to contracts. So CLM helps all these aspects of the contract lifecycle and all the dimensions of those. Next slide, please. Now, why use CLM? Well, broadly speaking, you can look at CLM as having three basic categories of benefits. There are efficiency improvements, productivity gains that arise because of enabling a business user to quickly create within the system the contract that meets the business needs, for legal to only be called in to review that if their system detects that there's deviation from standard language. And if there are none, it gets done quickly. Saves a lot of legal time. So lawyers having to review every line and every word of every contract, they now only need to review draft contracts where the system says there's deviation you need to be aware of. And not only productivity gains, faster cycle times, being able to close contracts in a much shorter period of time. There are effectiveness improvements. Effectiveness would mean reduction in risks of various kinds. Could be avoidance of the wrong contract action. For example, having a contract cancel that you want to retain, or having a contract automatically renewed when you really want to replace it and you miss those. And there are hard monetary benefits, performance and payments that may be tied directly to contract terms. And if you don't agree to those and are not aware of them, then you could suffer penalties, or you could gain benefits by doing so. So CLM we found in a number of studies pays for itself in very meaningful, large ways around efficiency improvements, effective improvements, and these hard monetary benefits. So one of the very strong economic case for investing in CLM. Next slide, please. Now, what we found over the years of studying CLM and working with clients is that the typical CLM solution delivers these three types of values in effectively 6 stages of implementation. Now, this is a very generic type of model, and there are going to be variations that we found over the years, but in general, this is the flow. So most companies, when they buy a CLM, the first step is we need to get all our contracts in the repository. Now, that in itself has benefits. It cuts the cost of finding contracts. As I said, you don't have to call down to legal and said, can you pull that contract, send it up to me, which clearly has a cost and time of labor to doing it. Or cost of mailing if you have to mail a contract from a central office to a remote office. It also helps in tracking renewals, making sure those contracts that you wanted to renew, you're aware of, and you can do it in time. So once you want to expire, you're aware so you can make sure they don't get renewed automatically. The next stage most companies attack is then, with those contracts in the repository, we want to understand what's in there. We want to understand duplicates. We want to understand obligations. We want to understand conflicts. We want to see what rights we're entitled to. So analysis and reporting of contracts is typically the second stage. Now, this also can renew itself because there's first level reporting, which is there, but there's then more sophisticated reporting, which will come to later. The next stage most companies go is then automate the contract creation process. As I said, the design of a CLM is to try and get the routine task of creating a contract out of the legal and into the hands of business who have the contract need contracting requirements, who know what should be in the contract, and allow them to quickly assemble the appropriate contract for their business purpose, but to do so in a way that retains all the controls over what should be in that contract. And as I said earlier, one benefit is that legal doesn't have to review every contract. Once it's in place and they trust the system, if the system says this contract has no deviations from standard language, there is nothing you need to review, we can say, fine, we'll go on to the next contract. So I said faster cycle times, and of course, faster cycle times can also have real benefits in terms of accelerating revenues or savings. On the sales side, being able to close deals at the end of the quarter and not have potential deals with $100,000, multi-million-dollar consequences tied up in a legal review. As I said, there's a connection of CLM to the upstream apps that are used by employees in the day-to-day jobs as part of these processes of managing partner relationships. And so much more efficient use of employee time and being able to have together the contract data and all the other data around the customer, around the supplier, in terms of turning leads into contracts or turning deals into contracts. There's a downstream integration of transaction systems into CLM, so you get that more complete and automated compliance on a data transaction basis with contract language. And then the last stage is when companies actually are able to use the system to start to identify where are the gaps in our contract language, where are the items that we should have included, the statements, the requirements, the specific language that we needed to have in our contracts but didn't to avoid business problems to get most business value. Next slide. Now, each of these stages, though, have their own sets of implementation challenges. So, stage one, all contracts in electronic repository. Well, first, where are all the contracts? It may not be as simple as you think. You may have contracts locked up, or not locked up, but buried in different SharePoint servers. How do you find them? And once you find the contracts, there is the task of how do you import them, and import them so that you apply the right metadata tag into the contracts. metadata tags for intellectual property, for indemnity clause, for governing law, for any issue that you're dealing with. Where is it? What is it? So we know what that is. Analysis and reporting has its own issues. Yes, there are going to be typically some standard reports, but are they right ones? Are they configured to our needs? And every company's going to also have its own set of analytics that they want. Analytics that allow them to understand the contract portfolio risks, the contract entitlements, the obligations. So how do you create those? Make sure you've got a set of analytics that allows those, typically in legal, could be those in finance, could be those in sales, could be those in purchasing, to really delve into and understand what does that contract portfolio mean to our business. Automating the contract creation process. There's the issue of, well, what is that library of standard terms and conditions? What should it be? How do we create those? And how do we adapt those over time? What are the rules that we want to have for what can and can't be changed in contract language? What's going to be the workflow we have in place so we can make sure that if there is a change in the contract language, it goes to the right person? Because maybe it's a change that doesn't have legal implications, that's business. So it may have to go to head of sales or chief procurement officer. Or maybe it's a change that does have impact on legal, it needs to go to legal for that. And how do you link e-signature into that process? In terms of connecting with upstream apps, what's the relevant ones? What's the process flow here? What people are doing in a given day? What are the apps that they need to get their task done, and how do we make sure we integrate those apps, and how do we create a common user interface? So a person who, in the course of the day, might be doing a sourcing event in the morning, but then doing contract negotiations in the afternoon, can do so through a common interface, common data. The integration of transaction systems is both a technical issue, but it's also, in many cases, a funding issue. It costs money. And who pays for that, and how do we get that done? And of course, once the money is secured, how do you actually do that? How is the integration actually accomplished? And then the last one is, first of all, you've got to have fully automated contract compliance, because anytime there's a gap between what you expect to get from a contract and your actual results, the first question you have to ask is, well, is this gap due to lack of full contract compliance? And in most cases it is. So you've got to eliminate that as a possibility. But once you've eliminated that, now you can start to see, where are we getting business results that were not what we expected? And how do we need to change our contract language or contract process to eliminate those, bring actuals closer into what we expect? Next slide. So this is where artificial intelligence can come in. As we've been looking at the CLM market and looking at what vendors are doing, we've concluded that there are really 7 areas within the contracting process, within the contracting analytics, within the contract technologies that AI can help address some of these challenges and difficulties I just went through. The most common area, and the area right now of greatest value, is in that task of importing contracts, especially third-party contracts, being able to bring a third-party contract in and then very quickly apply at first pass as to what is the intellectual property clause, what is the indemnity clause, what is the governing law clause. Find those, apply the right metadata tags against them, so when they come in, you can take a process which otherwise might take an hour or 2 of legal time and make it a very quick matter of 30, 60-second time to get that brought in. Another issue that's arising, and it's becoming more and more coming to the fore, is what I call the metadata trap. When you set up a CLM system, you do so with a set of predefined metadata categories. But those metadata categories may be designed to address a new issue like coronavirus, or an earlier issue like GDPR. So how do you find all the contracts that might be impacted by that new one? This is where you want some AI that can be able to go across that contract portfolio and use tools to actually find the right language and then apply a new metadata tag against that across the whole contract base. I flagged earlier the issue and challenge of integrating CLM to transaction systems. And how do you make that happen? I said this is typically a major challenge. AI can help by mapping CLM system, transaction system, keep those maps up to date, keep them in line with changings at either side, and make sure that integration continues to run smoothly. This has become more and more important. This managing unanticipated risk is not just finding the language, but it's actually being able to then get analytics around what does that risk, where does it surface, and what does it mean for our business. Determining if our contracts are meeting our business objectives is related to that. Starting to do analytics that compare what we expect to get from what we want to get. Some fairly simple tasks that are still important, but are becoming declining value. When an employee goes to find the right contract, providing an interface, a smart wizard that will quickly, through a series of evolving questions, identify their business need, identify their business objective, and use that information to assemble the appropriate contract for their purposes, and do so in a learning way that moves from static rules to dynamic rules. And the last one is streamlining how business and legal works together to approve deviations from standard contract language. As I said earlier, in many cases, the value of CLM comes to helping that work more smoothly. And so AI can make that happen more easily. Next slide. So let's take a minute, though, to talk about artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a word, a concept that is used loosely and wildly and widely, but it has actually some very specific meanings here. And AI, you can think of as technologies that are designed to mimic certain humans' abilities to sense, to think, and to act. So sensing AI includes human recognition and machine recognition. Being able to recognize a person, for example, or being able to recognize through image or voice analytics, but also able to recognize text and what's in that text. There's acting AI, which includes virtual agents, or sometimes called bots, natural language generation, being able to generate an appropriate voice response based upon interaction, robotic process automation to make the appropriate decision that normally be made in expert system decision management to help guide people to the right decision they need to make at any point to have to make a choice. And there's thinking AI, which includes knowledge representation, rules engines, machine learning, text analytics, natural language processing, text analytics. All different types of AI focused against different types of problems. And these can be combined in different ways, as I said, to try and help technology mimic people's ability to sense, think, and act. So let's go to the next slide. Within the context of CLM, what we found over the years is that CLM vendors, are utilizing some of these tools, but not necessarily others. So machine learning platforms, decision management, semantic analysis, AI-enhanced analytics, text analytics, natural language processing, intelligent recommendation, virtual image, those are all ones that are being very widely adopted. But different things like speech recognition or image, not so critical when it comes to contracts. Contracts don't really get spoken. They don't really have images in general, so not common there. So it's certainly a specific subset of AI tools that are being deployed against specific problems, and we'll come to those in a second. So let's actually go through some of the gaps that we saw and then how AI is being used to address those. Next slide, please. So let's start with that first task of contract repositories and contract reporting and analytics. Some of these are things I've already flagged. So importing legacy and third-party contracts. So using the innovation is using natural language processing and machine learning to import the contracts and apply the appropriate metadata tags to the relevant language here. There's also an innovation that's occurring around extracting the business end of the contract. What is in there? What are deliverables, milestones, obligations? How are they being presented? What SLAs, what KPIs, and how much? What's the rate card? What price books? You would think this might be simple. In practice, it turns out it's not. Especially if you move from goods contracts, where it might actually be straightforward, into services contracts, where there might not be an obvious price schedule you can look at, but instead it's buried in the language in the contract that you can extract that out. Another innovation lies in identifying compliance or risk issues in the contract portfolio. So here, vendors are using a combination of semantic analysis. Semantic analysis, it looks at a cluster of words and finds relationships in those clusters, finds the nouns and the verbs that go together, finds the adjectives and the adverbs that are related to that, finds similar words, customer being, in many cases, analogous to client, and uses those analytics with natural language processing to find those clusters of words in the paragraph that relate to an issue that, like a coronavirus or like GDPR, that you would never thought to identify with a metadata tag. Now you want to be able to find that across a portfolio. Then third is reporting and analysis of unanticipated issues. You might have a standard portfolio of issues of reports, but you've got a new challenge of, okay, how do we understand in our contract portfolio, all the contracts that we have that could be impacted by a force majeure situation? What do we do with those? How do we know which ones are the serious ones? How do we know which ones are the ones we don't have to worry about? How to prioritize that? So AI is helping that process of reporting analysis of unanticipated issues. Next slide, please. In the stage of contract creation negotiation, helping users create the right contract. As I've said several times, a good CLM system is designed to put this task of creating a contract in the hands of the business user. It's typically done through a fairly static rules engine, a wizard that says, if you want this type of, if you are doing this type of an agreement, here's the contract language you want, sales agreement, etc. That works fine, maybe 70%, 80% of the time, but you've got contracts that have new situations. So what AI is doing is using text analysis, natural language processing, and decision management to engage with users in a much more interactive dialogue, the way that a good lawyer would talk with the user to understand their needs, and then doing so, guide them to the right contract terms and conditions for the business need in a much more dynamic, much more evolving, much less static way than with a simple rules engine. A second area is getting rapid decisions on deviation of standard contract terms and conditions. There will be, in many cases, a draft contract that's created by a business user that deviates from standard language. A lawyer can go in and look at that. It might take them, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, to decide is that right or not. But if they've done this enough times, a tool like robotic process automation can learn from their decisions and then start to provide a recommendation to that lawyer to allow that person to more quickly decide, yep, we can accept it, no, we can't, based upon what they've done before. It may not make the decision automatically, but it makes the recommendation more visible and streamlines the time that the lawyer has to take to decide, do we accept this or not? Next slide. Around contract integration management, linking CLM to the transactional systems. I mentioned earlier that there's a critical need that occurs around stage 4 or stage 5 of linking CLM to transaction systems. This has turned out to be a major stumbling point. Many clients that we looked at and talked with have been able to get through those first 3 stages, even the first 4 stages. When it comes to integration transaction systems, this is when they fell down. So there's new tools around AI that can be used to set up the application programming interface, the API, that will allow a much streamlined and ongoing and dynamic integration of the CLM data into the procurement system, the order management system, the invoice system, the customer service system, the risk management, any system that needs that data, and have that integration not just set up but maintained in a more automated way. But there's also another innovation arising about identifying all the data needed to manage contract execution. This is particularly important when it comes to services agreements, because service agreements, unlike goods agreements, have a lot of, let's put it this way, ambiguity, a lot of, well, actually, was it delivered? Did we get the right performance from them? So automated workflows to facilitate and track the completion of a service engagement, to make sure that consulting project that we had finished on time and delivered what we expected in the way of report or recommendation or presentation, whatever the outcome was. Being able to automate the performance and then check it against the invoice to make sure the invoice that we receive matches what the actual performance was. In some cases, there are going to be regulatory or policy compliance obligations associated with this engagement. The service provider may need to provide certification that its employees do in fact pass drug tests and have in fact achieved their compliance with insurance laws or training requirements, things of that kind. So being able to track those at a granular level, and being able to manage and track any governance issue and any action items related to this ongoing activity between the service provider and its customer over that life cycle of that engagement. Next slide. And it turns out that there are lots of contracts, that lots of processes that link to contracts. So this integration between CLM and between these other apps is not a simple one. On the sales side, CLM ties into revenue management. It obviously ties into Salesforce automation. It ties into order management. It ties directly into CPQ systems, whether those are used prior to the contract to determine what price or configuration or quote should be provided, or it gets executed after the contract, with the contract defining the key parameters, but then the actual price being calculated based upon those parameters versus transaction volumes or other indicators. And proposal management, the sales proposal that leads to a contract. On the buy side, invoicing, sourcing, procurement, project management, risk management. Contracts sit at the heart of all these processes, and how do you link them, integrate them, is no simple task, and that's why integration is so critical here. Next slide. Lastly, around contract optimization. First, making sure we get full contract compliance. After linking CLM with these transaction systems, being able to apply diagnostic analytics to identify contract leakage or areas of contract non-compliance. Where are they? You may think it's easy. In practice, it's not. Having to find those using diagnostic analytics is a good use of AI. Making sure the contract process is optimal, using process analytics and robotic process automation to identify and remove bottlenecks or delays in the contracting process, things that can stream that process and make it work more efficiently, faster, but at the same time make sure it has all the appropriate controls so no bad language slips into the process. And then lastly, and this still is very much on the frontier here, is figuring out why are contracts not accomplishing our business goals and what do we need to do to achieve that. This is definitely frontier stuff. It's almost not really common at all here, but it's being able to use predictive analytics to start to compare what the business results you got from a contract with what you expected to get and figure out why you got a deviation. Why is there a gap there? So AI is being used across all of these dimensions, and it's being used in a wide variety of different ways by a wide variety of different vendors. So how do you assess this? Next slide. Well, we've come up with a framework that a client can use in talking with a vendor to determine how mature is their AI functionality. It's a simplistic model. It's not perfect, but it gives a relatively good guide. And what we suggest is that you find out from the vendor where do they stand in each of these specific functions in terms of their AI development. So if you talk with a vendor and says, well, we have AI functions for automating the contract metadata tagging, but it's on a roadmap, then that vendor is really a pre-K. We say, well, we've actually got in development. We've got it, in the lab. We're expecting it. They're in kindergarten. The vendor said, oh, we actually have that function. It's out. We're in beta test with clients. It's equivalent to being a third grade. The vendor says, we have that AI function for automating that process of importing contracts. We've had it out in the market with our clients for about a year or so. Then that vendor's functions are out in 8th grade. The vendor says, well, we have that AI function for importing those and then applying metadata tags against those new contracts. It's been in the market for 2 to 3 years. Then it's in 11th grade. It says, well, we've had that in the market for 4 years or more, then kind of in college. Well, why does this matter? Well, if you think about, the task of applying metadata tags to a contract, is this something you would trust a well-trained 8th grader to do? Maybe, but probably not a lot. Would you trust an 11th grader who's completed some math classes and some English language classes, and maybe a science class or two? Yeah, maybe so. If it's a simple task of recognizing, a intellectual property clause, yeah. If it's something that you feel, look, we want the system to be able to determine, is that indemnity clause really in compliance with our requirements, then you may want a college person to do that. So as I said, it's not a perfect means, but it's not a bad shorthand way to assess, how mature is the vendor's offering. And you don't do it across the board. You do it against these specific functions we've talked about. Because a vendor may be very advanced, maybe in 11th grade around things like, contract importing, but they might be in kindergarten when it comes to analytics around predictive understanding risks in the contract portfolio. So you take the functions we identified and you take the vendor's capability and you use it to assess how far they're along. Next slide. So before I wrap up, though, there's a couple of other points I want to bring to the surface. If you haven't gotten the news yet from what I've said so far, it's really important that you get it now. CLM is, in my view, one of the most complex systems to deploy, not because of complexity, but because of the stakeholders and the different business users who touch the system. Contracts, as we said at the beginning, are fundamental to business relationships, but they touch everything. They touch employees, they touch suppliers, they touch customers. And as a result, the stakeholders who use contracts or use a CLM are all over the organization. You have the contract initiators, the salespeople, the purchase deal makers. Their goal is to get a contract created quickly. They need ease of use, link to other apps. They need e-signature. You've got the contract reviewers, those in legal or sales or purchasing sectors. They want to make sure new contracts are in compliance with policy. They want integration of Word. They want workflow. They want alerts. You've got the people who actually manage the relationship, the sales or purchasing account reps. Their goal is to make sure that they keep on top of that customer relationship, or supplier relationship. So they want online access to contracts. They want links to other relevant alerts on issues. Increasingly, we're seeing risk managers who understand, look, a lot of what we as risk managers deal with are risks that are embedded or should be embedded in contracts. So understand what are the risks and obligations of contract portfolio. They want analytics that can look into that total contract portfolio and see what are the risks, so we understand them and can deal with those. And increasingly, we're seeing finance and the CFO becoming stakeholders as they come to realize that, look, in our contract portfolio, There are contractual commitments that we have made to make payments to suppliers in fixed amounts or variable amounts over the next 2 years. We understand those. We have revenues that we are expecting. We're expecting to get revenues from customers in July 2021. How much are they? How conditional are those? What can we expect? So they're looking for analytics into the total contract portfolio as well. So next slide. What this really means is that you have literally 4, 5, some cases 6 stakeholders who will be involved in, have a voice in, want to have their views reflected in the choice of CLM system. But each of those stakeholders will look at CLM through a particular lens of their issues and therefore particular functions or steps in the product. So general counsels, obviously big stakeholders in this. They care a lot about contract repository, a lot about reports, a lot about contract negotiation, and a lot about contract optimization. But quite frankly, they don't really worry about contract execution. That's somebody else's problems. That's typically a CPO. That's typically going to be the head of sales who worry about those issues. Linked to upstream apps, the CPO is going to say, Chief Procurement Officer is going to say, I want my employees who are managing, sourcing, working on vendors to be able to do a sourcing event in the morning, do a contract negotiation in the afternoon, manage vendor relationship, all using the same interface. Head of sales is going to have a similar set. I need to have that link, that lead management and that proposal and that CPQ linked with that. And the CIO and the CFO have their own perspective on this. So the point is that CLM is very complicated, partly because of the functionality of the product, but mostly because of the politics of it, that you've got to be able to satisfy all these different stakeholders who've got their own particular requirements. Next slide, please. So let's wrap it up. There are really 4 basic points that I want you to take away from this presentation. Point 1. It's critical you think holistically across a contract lifecycle. It's not enough to view contracts as just a task that involves creating a new contract. It's not enough to say, well, it's just a matter of getting all our contracts in one place so we can find them. You've got to think across all the stages of contract life, from its initiation to its negotiation, its finalization, its execution, its replacement. And so you've got to plan for all the phases of CLM implementations. You can't have a plan that gets you through contract creation and stops. You've got to engage comprehensively. You've got to get all stakeholders involved, legal as well as business. I can't tell you how many times I've had discussions with people looking at CLM, and it's the head of sales who's talking about, but there's no legal person in the room. Or it's legal talking about, but there's no business stakeholders in the room. You've got to get all those folks involved because each of them have a stake in this, because they're stakeholders, of course, but also because they have their own requirements, and you've got to make sure that they're involved. Because if not, then you might have a solution that legal uses, but nobody else uses, or the sales uses, but legal doesn't use, and that, of course, defeats the purpose. One of the key points here is don't stop with CLM when the contract is signed. That's where legal, as I said, will typically say, we're done. But you got to go move beyond. You got to move contract management, contract compliance, and contract optimization. You've got to think about moving there. And the last point is these are all challenges. These are all difficulties. But there are new AI functions that are coming to the market, that are coming into products, that can help companies support the later phase of implementation where we've seen the biggest gaps, but also improve support for the initial phase of implementation where it turns out things are not quite as simple as you thought. Getting those contracts in the repository once may not be enough if new requirements come in and you can't find in the contracts that you've got the contracts that are relevant to that new requirement. So with that, let me stop and thank you for my session and turn it over to Ajay.
Andrew, thank you. Thank you. What an insightful commentary that was. And we saw all the years of your experience, particularly at the intersection of contract management and transaction or business management more broadly. Thank you very much again. So a quick introduction to Sirion Labs. Sirion was founded 7 years ago to leverage artificial intelligence to transform enterprise contract management. Simply put, there are three parts that I'm going to talk about: the past, the present, and the future. And how does contracting play into each of these three vectors? We have been very fortunate over these last 7 years to have worked with some of the world's largest companies like Vodafone, Unilever, EY, Credit Suisse, etc. We've been very fortunate that we've been able to add a huge amount of value to those clients. So, quite apart from managing more than 300 billion in TCV, we have been able to audit about $40 billion worth of invoices for our clients and reduce those clients by more than 2 billion. So this is a direct impact to their bottom line, and this is some of the things that really makes us a valued platform. Let's talk a little about more concretely about some of the things that Andrew was mentioning in terms of artificial intelligence in contracting. Let's take some concrete examples and see how it really works. So I spoke of three aspects of artificial intelligence in contracting: the past, the present, and the future. What you're seeing in front of you is an application of AI to examining the past. The past really, what is the past? The past is the legacy contract portfolio. These are the things that we inherit. These are the things that we have to live with. And rather than deploying elbow grease, an army of human beings to go and read those contracts to understand what's inside them, what's been committed, the promises that have been made, the risks that have been inherited, can we use AI to automatically extract, like the example right in front of you, can we extract not just the metadata and the clauses, but the actual commitments or obligations and performance that are sitting inside the contract? So this example here shows you how AI can be used to extract the service attributes and the performance obligations that are due from a supplier and put them in a structured way on the right-hand side, which is now ready for management, which can now be assigned to a human being and coupled with some alerts and reminders and the storage of artifacts. So this is the journey on the left-hand side from the past to the present on the right side. The unstructured past giving way to the structured present on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. Now let's talk a little more about how this plays out from an analytic perspective. Once all of these contracts, when we zoom out of that individual contract and we look at the portfolio as a whole, what has AI told us? How many different types of agreements do we have? What kinds of provisions do they have, and what kind of provisions are missing from them? How many of our agreements do not, for example, have data protection clauses? And so on and so forth. So this is still using AI to identify and highlight risks in our inherited legacy, in our inherited portfolio. We're still looking at the past. Let's now move forward into the current and into the future and see how AI can help us there. In this particular example, we're in the present. We are negotiating a live contract and we're getting drafts back from the counterparty, and they could be responses on our paper or they could be entirely drafted on the counterparty's paper. And the problem is that we have to reconcile this counterparty position with our playbook, with our preferred positions, and we need to understand what the deviations are, how risky their positions are, and how they work together as a whole. Is there any way that technology can highlight select clauses, can tag those clauses, compare them with the positions that we have in our playbook, and tell us what is the risk? Is it corresponding to our preferred position? Is it corresponding to our walkaway position? How risky or how risk-free is this particular draft? So that's another example of AI assisting contract managers and lawyers in drafting contracts. This is an active use of AI in the present, let's say. Now that we've finished with this, let's say that the contract has been negotiated and signed. We turn now more to the future. And the future is actually, the early part of the future is bringing that contract to life. I'm very fond of saying, and I think Andrew is a big supporter of this, that conventional contract management involves burying the contract in a graveyard. And you don't know, you put a name, you put a date on that graveyard, and that's about it, right? All the promises that were in the contract die with that contract as it's put inside the graveyard. So the question is, can we, once we've extracted these promises, how do we bring them to life? And this is where the second part of what Andrew said really rings true for me. The contract management system must talk to other business transaction software systems. So the example in front of you shows you on the left how it's integrating with an ITSM system like ServiceNow to compute the service levels globally. On the bottom right, it's showing you how it's integrating with an ERP or an AP tool or a P2P tool to audit the actual invoice and to see whether the invoice line items are accurately computed as per the underlying contract. Next slide. And continuing in that same vein, we can see how once this integration with core transaction systems is complete, the larger picture of value starts to come to life. We start to see what was our expected versus actual spend. We start seeing the spend by region, by country, and so on and so forth. And so this actually helps us to track against the original business case. It helps us to keep track of the anticipated value from that engagement and not just whether the invoice line item per se was accurate. Next slide, please. Once we've learned about the risk of the past, once we've learned to organize and manage our present, what can AI tell us about the future? For example, our business people told us that they forecasted XYZ amount of demand. We went ahead, we negotiated the contract, we made that forecast to the supplier. The actual demand, however, went over or went below. Now, what do we learn from that? Every time our business makes a forecast, we can make a dynamic adjustment to that to predict future demand. So this is an example of how we learn from the past. Or for example, the business asked for a service level of 99.95 and their actual usage of that never exceeded 99.9. How do we know that? Because many times the service level was breached. It went below 99.95, but there were no complaints from business. We had a lot of negative friction with the supplier because of the breaches of the service levels, but the underlying business users seemed completely unaffected. That tells us we negotiated that service level too high. So these are examples of the AI learning from the past and the present to help us shape the future. And I think I wanted to leave you with these concrete, next slide please. I wanted to leave you with these concrete examples of AI in action as a way to bring some of Andrew's messages to life. I want to also thank all of you for joining, and we do have 3 or 4 minutes left, so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague DJ to field some questions. Over to you, DJ.
Thank you, Ajay. Quickly, we've got a few questions here. The first one is for Andrew, and the question is, who would you say are the most important stakeholders when it comes to the selection of a CLM system?
If I were to name one stakeholder, it would be the general counsel. General counsels, almost always have the direct responsibility for the contracts, both in negotiation, language, and there. So general counsel is first and foremost, but general counsel isn't the only one. The second stakeholder is going to really depend upon what's the primary role of your contracts. For a lot of industries, the contracts really show up on the buy side. Take, for example, B2C retail, education, government, healthcare. They don't really have buy-side customers. Sell-side customers, they have buy-side. So for that, in that industries, it's going to be the CPO is the second stakeholder. But there are other industries where the real challenges lie on the sell side. Professional services is a key example of that. Pharmaceuticals, other ones where there's a lot of deviations, challenges, etc. There, in that case, it's going to be the head of sales who's going to be the second most important one. In general, the CFO is not a primary one. We're seeing CFOs becoming more and more involved as they realize the value of the data here. So again, in rough order of priority, general counsel always, then typically either head of sales or CPO, depending upon the contract. And then could be both if you've got both buy-side and sell-side contracts. And then, as I said, the CFO is typically the fourth one. And CIO plays a role as the one to make sure this fits with our overall architecture. So CIOs also play kind of an underpinning role.
Thank you, Andrew. We'll squeeze in one more question. This one is for Ajay. Most CLMs today claim to be AI CLMs. what is the right way to compare AI capabilities across CLM providers?
Yeah, great question, DJ. And I think if you flip back to the slides that we were showing a little while earlier, the answer is quite obvious. The first is how deep is the extraction capability of the CLM? When it's looking at your past, when it's looking at your legacy contracts, how deep is it really going in extracting the information from it? A lot of platforms claim, if you keep going back, please, a lot of platforms claim that they can extract the information from a contract, but what they are really saying is that they can extract a particular clause from it, the entire language of the clause. For example, a governing law clause could say this clause shall be governed by the Republic, by the laws of the Republic of Austria without respect to its governing law, conflict of laws principles. That's not useful. What you want is the word Austria from there. So that's the next level, which is the metadata level of extraction. But according to me, that's still on the legal side of the fence, as Andrew puts it. The most important information is the business end of the contract. And those are your obligations, your service levels, and your price books. And I think so the first thing for me is the AI going into the business end of the contract? Is it extracting the promises, the service levels, and the pricing information? That's the first yardstick. And then turning to the next yardstick is how easy is that system making it for you to manage those obligations or service levels? So if you go to the next slide, is it showing you a way to connect with your other transaction systems? Keep going. Is it showing it, is it making it easy for you to connect with your other transaction systems and actually measure the performance of that vendor real time, or to audit any of their invoices? So that for me is about going beyond using the AI to go past the contract into the world of business. And I think the final aspect for me is, can it really dynamically learn from those lessons of the past and predict what lies ahead for us? Can it help us to reshape the contract or to reshape our demand or usage or any of these important business decisions? For me, these are the three important things. It's all about what's underneath the surface.
Thank you, Ajay. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we're going to conclude the webinar. You will see a survey at the end. Please do fill it out to give us your feedback. And we look forward to seeing you at our future webinars. You will also receive a recording of the webinar along with the slides after the webinar closes. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you to the panelists as well.
Thank you.